At the customer service desk of Riverside Community Bank, 67-year-old Margaret "Maggie" Thompson was depositing a $500 check into her granddaughter Emily's college fund. With her pink Angora cardigan, floral-patterned purse, and silver hair arranged in a neat bun, she looked like the perfect grandmother. She proudly showed young bank employee Jessica a photo of Emily from her purse, saying, "She just turned 18, wants to study medicine." Jessica smiled warmly, saying, "What a lucky girl," when the bank's main door burst open with a tremendous crash. 5 masked men in black clothing stormed in with automatic weapons. The leader, a large man with a gold chain around his neck and tattoos on his arms, shouted, "Everyone on the ground. Hands behind your heads." Customers screamed and dropped to the floor. Jessica's face went white with terror. Maggie also began to crouch down slowly, but the robbers barely noticed her, just a harmless grandmother. The leader looked at Maggie with a mocking smile, "Grandma, get down and nobody gets hurt. Stay calm, we're just taking some money and leaving." As Maggie slowly crouched down, keeping her voice very low, as if talking to herself, she murmured, "Sweetie, I worked for the CIA from 1978 to 2001. I killed men like you for 40 years. You weren't even in your mother's womb yet." The leader didn't hear this, but it reached the ears of the young robber next to him. And that young man was beginning to notice Maggie's calm posture, her perfect stance, and that cold gleam in her eyes. Smash that subscribe button if you're obsessed with badass grandmothers, CIA legends hiding in plain sight, and bank robberies that go horribly wrong. Was Maggie really just a sweet grandmother or the deadliest operative in CIA history? What made 5 armed robbers pick the wrong victim? Drop your wildest theories below and destroy that like button. Every like tells us you want more insane stories about hidden heroes living among us. For 23 years, Margaret Thompson had been the most convincing actress in Riverside County, and she hadn't even been trying. Every Tuesday, she visited Riverside Community Bank to manage her granddaughter's college fund. Every Friday, she played bridge with the church ladies. Every Sunday, she baked cookies for the neighborhood children. What none of them knew was that Margaret "Maggie" Thompson was actually Margaret "Ice Queen" Thorne, one of the CIA's most lethal operatives during the height of the Cold War. For 23 years, she had successfully buried her past so deep that even she sometimes forgot the woman she used to be. But some skills never fade. Some instincts never die. And some people make the fatal mistake of underestimating a grandmother who once eliminated enemy agents in 7 different countries. The 5 men who had just invaded Riverside Community Bank were about to learn this lesson the hard way. As Maggie continued her slow descent to the floor, her mind automatically shifted into the analytical mode that had kept her alive through decades of classified operations. Leader, approximately 6 feet 2 inches, 220 pounds, dominant hand favors right side, gold chain suggests vanity weakness, moves with prison yard confidence but lacks military precision. Second man, younger, nervous energy, finger on trigger, dangerous due to inexperience. Third man, covering the door, professional stance, likely military background. Fourth man, scanning customers, calculating mindset, potential tactician. Fifth man, watching her specifically, beginning to show signs of recognition or suspicion. The transformation was so subtle that even trained observers would have missed it. To everyone else, Maggie looked like a frightened grandmother slowly complying with armed robbers. But beneath that pink cardigan, the Ice Queen was awakening. "Ladies and gentlemen," the leader announced to the terrified bank customers, "this is a simple business transaction. We take some money, you go home to your families. Everyone cooperates, everyone lives." Maggie's trained ear caught the slight accent in his speech pattern. Eastern European, possibly Romanian. The tactical formation they'd used to enter suggested professional training. The weapons were clean, well-maintained, and expensive. This wasn't a desperate grab for cash. This was a calculated heist by people with resources and planning. Which meant they'd researched the bank, studied the security protocols, and chosen this specific time for a reason. Jessica, The young teller who had been helping Maggie, was trembling so violently that Maggie could hear her teeth chattering. The other customers, a businessman in a suit, a young mother with a baby, an elderly man with a walker, were all frozen in various stages of terror. But Maggie was calculating. Exit strategies. Weapon positions. Civilian safety protocols. The mental checklist that had become second nature during 2 decades of the world's most dangerous operations. The leader approached the teller windows, while his team maintained positions covering the customers and exits. Professional. Disciplined. But they'd made one critical error. They'd assumed that everyone in the bank was a civilian. The young robber who had partially heard Maggie's murmured comment was named Viktor Petrov, and he was beginning to feel an inexplicable sense of unease. Something about the elderly woman's posture was wrong. She was too calm, too controlled. Her breathing was steady. Her hands weren't shaking. In his experience, everyone reacted to armed robbery with fear. Civilians panicked, cried, begged, or froze. But this grandmother was doing none of those things. Viktor was the son of a former KGB operative who had immigrated to America in the 1990s. He'd grown up hearing stories about CIA agents, about the Cold War, about operatives who could kill with their bare hands and disappear like ghosts. His father had shown him photographs from the old days, intelligence files, operational reports. And one name had appeared repeatedly in those documents, Margaret "Ice Queen" Thorne. The CIA operative who had eliminated more Soviet assets than any other American agent. The woman who had disappeared after 2001 and was assumed dead or permanently retired. Viktor studied Maggie's profile as she knelt on the bank floor. The bone structure was right. The age was right. And there was something about the way she held herself that triggered memories of his father's warnings about American operatives. Papa always said the most dangerous CIA agents were the ones who looked harmless, Viktor whispered to himself in Russian. That's when Maggie's head turned slightly toward him, and Viktor saw her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a frightened grandmother. They were the eyes of a predator assessing threats and calculating responses. Dmitri, Viktor called quietly to the leader, we might have a problem. But Dmitri was focused on the bank vault, barking orders at the terrified manager to open the security systems. He waved Viktor off dismissively. Maggie had heard the exchange in Russian, and her mind instantly translated. She also recognized the family resemblance. Viktor looked remarkably like Alexei Petrov, a KGB operative she'd encountered in Prague in 1987. If this was Alexei's son, then Viktor might recognize her from old intelligence photographs. Which meant her cover was blown, and she needed to act fast. What happened next occurred so quickly that the bank's security cameras barely captured it. Maggie Thompson, loving grandmother, ceased to exist. In her place stood Margaret, Ice Queen, Thorne, the CIA operative who had survived Prague, Budapest, Berlin, and a dozen other cities where discovery meant death. Her first move was to neutralize the immediate threat. Viktor was reaching for his radio to alert the team, but Maggie was already moving. From her crouched position, she rolled toward him with a fluidity that defied her 67 years, using a technique she'd perfected in Moscow in 1983. Viktor's weapon was in his hands, but Maggie was inside his reach before he could bring it to bear. Her hands found pressure points with muscle memory precision. Viktor was unconscious before he hit the floor. The businessman in the suit looked up in shock, but Maggie gestured for him to stay down and remain silent. She had work to do. Dmitri, still focused on the vault, hadn't noticed his team member's disappearance. The other 3 robbers were positioned to watch exits and customers, but their sight lines didn't include the area where Maggie had been kneeling. Margaret began moving through the bank with the silent precision that had once made her the CIA's most feared infiltration specialist. Pink cardigan and all, she was a ghost navigating familiar territory. Her mind automatically calculated the tactical situation: for remaining hostiles, approximately 15 civilians, multiple exit points, limited cover, no backup. Standard extraction protocol under hostile conditions. The difference was that this time, she wasn't trying to escape. She was trying to save innocent lives. The second robber went down 3 minutes later. He was positioned near the customer seating area, focused on watching the front entrance. He never saw Margaret approaching from his blind spot, never felt the pressure point technique that rendered him unconscious, never knew that a grandmother in a pink cardigan had just neutralized him with skills learned in the deadliest intelligence training program in the world. Maggie carefully positioned his unconscious body so that his absence wouldn't be immediately noticed by his colleagues. She also secured his weapon, checking the ammunition and safety mechanisms with the automatic proficiency of someone who had handled firearms in life-or-death situations for decades. The third robber proved more challenging. He was older, more experienced, and had positioned himself with clear sight lines to multiple areas of the bank. Margaret recognized the tactical intelligence in his positioning. This was the former military member of the group. But Margaret had fought actual military personnel in actual war zones. She knew how soldiers thought, how they reacted, how they could be misdirected. She used the bank's architecture to her advantage, creating a sound distraction that drew his attention away from his optimal position. When he moved to investigate, Margaret was waiting with a combination of pressure point techniques and leverage tactics that put him unconscious without a sound. 3 down. 2 to go. But the remaining 2 were the most dangerous, Dimitri, the leader, and the tactical expert who was covering the main exit. By the time Dimitri realized that his team was missing, Margaret had already positioned herself for the final phase of her impromptu operation. Victor. Pavel. Report. Dimitri barked into his radio. Silence. Dimitri's eyes scanned the bank, taking inventory of his men. The customers were still on the floor where they belonged, but 3 of his team members were nowhere to be seen. That's when he noticed the elderly woman in the pink cardigan was also missing. "Where's the grandmother?" he demanded of the remaining robber. Margaret answered by stepping into view, no longer the harmless elderly woman he'd dismissed earlier. Her posture was different, her movement was different, and most importantly, she was holding Pavel's weapon with the confident grip of someone who knew exactly how to use it. "Dmitry Volkov," she said in perfect Russian, "you're under citizen's arrest for armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and making me miss my bridge game." Dimitri's face went white. Not because of the arrest threat, but because he recognized the voice. His father had been SVR, and he'd heard recordings of CIA operatives from the Cold War era. "Ice Queen," he whispered. "Retired," Margaret corrected. But apparently not completely. The final robber, realizing that his team had been systematically eliminated by a senior citizen, made the fatal mistake of trying to use the civilians as human shields. That's when Margaret demonstrated why the CIA had considered her their most effective field operative for over 2 decades. What the bank's security cameras recorded next would become legendary in law enforcement circles, though the footage would remain classified for national security reasons. Margaret, Ice Queen, Thorne, 67 years old, grandmother of 3, bridge club champion, and former CIA operative, single-handedly neutralized 5 armed robbers without firing a shot, without harming a single civilian, and without removing her pink cardigan. The final robber was unconscious before he could threaten the hostages. Dimitri found himself face down on the marble floor, zip-tied with bank supplies, wondering how a grandmother had dismantled his entire operation in under 15 minutes. When police arrived, they found a scene that defied explanation. 5 unconscious robbers, secured and disarmed, and an elderly woman in a pink cardigan calmly checking on the welfare of the bank customers. "Ma'am," the lead officer said, "can you tell us what happened here?" Margaret looked around at the civilians she protected, at the young teller Jessica who was staring at her with a mixture of awe and confusion, at the aftermath of an operation that had required her to use skills she'd hoped never to need again. 5 men tried to rob the bank," she said simply. "They slipped and fell." The officer looked at the perfectly secured robbers, the precisely positioned weapons, the tactical efficiency of the scene. "All 5 of them? At the same time?" Margaret smiled the gentle smile of a grandmother who bakes cookies for neighborhood children. It was quite clumsy of them. 3 hours later, FBI agent Sarah Chen arrived at Riverside Community Bank to investigate what local police were calling the most professional neutralization of armed robbers in departmental history. Agent Chen had been briefed on the preliminary reports, but nothing had prepared her for what she found in the bank's security footage. She watched Margaret Thompson move through the bank like a force of nature, displaying combat skills that suggested extensive military or intelligence training. Chen ran the elderly woman's identification through federal databases and got a result that made her heart stop. Margaret, Ice Queen, Thorne. CIA Operative, 1978 to 2001. Classified clearance level beyond Chen's access authorization. Chen made a phone call to Langley. 20 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up outside the bank, and a man in an expensive suit approached Margaret, who was giving her statement to local police. "Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, "my name is Director Harrison. We need to talk." Margaret looked at the man who had interrupted her peaceful retirement, at the badge that identified him as current CIA administration, at the inevitable complications that were about to re-enter her life. "I was hoping this day would never come," she said. "So were we. But your actions today have raised some questions that need answers." Margaret glanced around at the civilians she'd saved, at the bank employees who were alive because she'd refused to let innocent people be harmed, at the quiet life she'd built over 23 years of successful retirement. "Director Harrison, I'm 67 years old. I play bridge on Fridays and bake cookies on Sundays. I haven't been an operative for over 2 decades. Ma'am, with all due respect, what you did here today suggests otherwise." Margaret considered this. She thought about Emily's college fund, about the peaceful life she'd built, about the woman she'd become versus the woman she used to be. "Director, some skills fade with age. Others become wisdom. What happened here today wasn't about being an operative. It was about being a human being who couldn't stand by while innocent people were threatened." Director Harrison studied the elderly woman who had just demonstrated capabilities that active CIA operatives would struggle to match. "Mrs. Thompson, your country could use someone with your skills. My country has had my skills for 23 years. Now my granddaughter needs her grandmother more than the CIA needs another operative." Harrison nodded slowly. "We understand. But there might be situations where—" "Director," Margaret interrupted gently, "I spent 23 years of my life serving in shadows, eliminating threats, protecting national security. I gave my youth, my anonymity, and almost my life to that service. Now I give my time to my family and my community." She gestured toward the bank customers who were still being interviewed by police. "Today wasn't about resuming my old life. It was about protecting my new one. These people aren't assets or targets or strategic objectives. They're my neighbors. Jessica helps me with my banking every Tuesday. Mr. Rodriguez brings me fresh vegetables from his garden. Mrs. Chen watches my house when I visit Emily at college." Harrison was beginning to understand. "This was about family," he said. "Everything I do now is about family. And sometimes, protecting family requires skills learned in previous careers." Director Harrison made his decision. "Mrs. Thompson, your file will remain sealed. This incident will be classified as a civilian intervention. You're free to return to your retirement." "Thank you. But," Harrison added with a slight smile, "if you ever get bored with bridge and cookies." Margaret laughed, the warm laugh of a grandmother who had successfully protected the people she loved. "Director, I'm 67 years old. I've seen enough excitement for several lifetimes. From now on, the most dangerous thing I plan to do is compete in the church bake-off." 6 months later, Margaret Thompson was featured in the Riverside Community Newsletter for winning first place in the annual cookie competition for the 3rd consecutive year. The article mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Mrs. Thompson had been present during the incident at the local bank, but had been unharmed. What the article didn't mention was that Riverside Community Bank had become the safest financial institution in the county, not because of increased security measures, but because word had quietly spread through certain circles that the bank was under the unofficial protection of a retired CIA operative who looked like everyone's favorite grandmother. Local criminals had learned to avoid Riverside Community Bank entirely. Not because they feared the security systems, but because they'd heard stories about an elderly woman in a pink cardigan who could neutralize armed robbers with her bare hands. Margaret continued her quiet retirement, playing bridge on Fridays, baking cookies on Sundays, and visiting Emily at medical school whenever possible. But she also started teaching self-defense classes at the community center, ostensibly for senior citizens who wanted to feel safer in their neighborhoods. What her students didn't know was that they were learning techniques from one of the CIA's most legendary operatives, techniques that had been proven effective in the world's most dangerous situations. The most important lesson, Margaret told her students, isn't how to fight. It's how to avoid fighting. But if someone threatens innocent people, if someone endangers your family or your community, then you do whatever is necessary to protect them. One student, a grandmother named Rose, raised her hand. "Mrs. Thompson, where did you learn these techniques?" Margaret smiled the gentle smile that had become her trademark in retirement. "Oh, here and there. You pick things up over the years." Rose nodded, satisfied with the answer, not knowing that she was learning self-defense from a woman who had once been considered the most dangerous operative in CIA's arsenal. That evening, Margaret received a call from Emily. "Grandma, I heard about what happened at the bank. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just helped some people who needed help." The news said armed robbers were stopped by an unidentified civilian. "You weren't involved, were you?" Margaret looked at her pink cardigan hanging in the closet, at the peaceful home she'd built over 23 years of retirement, at the normal life she'd created after decades of extraordinary service. "Emily, your grandmother is just a retired woman who plays bridge and bakes cookies. Nothing more exciting than that ever happens to me." "Good. I worry about you living alone." Margaret smiled. "Don't worry about me, dear. I can take care of myself." After hanging up, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and settled into her favorite chair with a mystery novel. Outside, Riverside was quiet and peaceful, protected by a grandmother who had once protected the world. Some heroes wear capes. Some carry badges. Some pilot fighter jets or command armies. And some wear pink cardigans and bake the best chocolate chip cookies in the county. But when innocent lives are threatened, when families need protecting, when evil men make the mistake of underestimating a grandmother who used to be the CIA's ice queen, those heroes remind the world that courage comes in many forms. Margaret Thompson closed her book, turned off the lights, and went to bed, satisfied that her neighbors were safe, her granddaughter was pursuing her dreams, and her secret was secure. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody suspects. And sometimes the greatest legends are the ones that hide in plain sight, wearing pink cardigans and carrying floral purses, ready to protect their families and communities when the moment demands it. The Ice Queen was retired. But Grandma Maggie was just getting started.